Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 2024-25 new coordinator training from the California Department of Education. We're here to provide some guidance, support, and hopefully teach you some things that may help you be a success in your new role. That said, my name is Paul Valencia, and I will be your producer for today's webinar, which is a focus on accessibility. Before we hand it off to our very knowledgeable presenters, let's address a few housekeeping items. First, all participants are muted, and therefore, in order to submit your questions during the presentation, you may use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Please do not confuse this with the chat feature. For this webinar, we will only be using the questions and answers feature for questions. Second, a copy of today's resource guide was sent to you via email. If you haven't received it, or you need to access it again, the link has been placed in the chat box, and I'll drop it in there right now. Clicking on the link will take you to a folder where you can download the guide or make a copy into your own Google Drive. Please note that there is no edit access from the link we shared. You have to make your own copy first. And lastly, we will be recording today's presentation. An archive of this presentation will be available to view on the upcoming and on-demand trainings webpage on the CAASPP and ELPAC website. All righty, with that, I'd like to introduce today's expert panelists. We're very fortunate to have with us today Erin Gordon from San Diego County Office of Education and Stephen Bartlett from Los Angeles County Office of Education.
Well, thank you, Paul. As Paul mentioned, my name is Erin Gordon from San Diego County Office of Education. I'm so excited to be here this afternoon to talk about accessibility. It's one of my favorite topics. So, what is our agenda for the next hour? Well, we're briefly going to cover the why of accessibility, and specifically why accessibility is so important in assessments. Then we're going to jump into the 1, 2, 3, 4s of accessibility. And then we're going to cover the individual student assessment accessibility profile. That is a mouthful. So usually we refer to it as the ISAP process. Then we're going to cover, we're going to answer your questions right after we assign you some homework. All right. So we do want to take a few moments to talk about the format of our new coordinator trainings for 2024-25. So the following pieces are included in the new coordinator training as asynchronous or on-demand pre-work. So the pre-work is optional, and it's really meant for those who need additional information. The pre-work includes a video on resources, which covers agencies, websites, manuals, flyers, and other deliverables to support you as coordinators in your new role. And there's a video about the coordinator role, which covers the LEA coordinator as well as site level and test administrator levels. The introduction to SIRS training, which takes place in the summer and the fall, that's also included in the pre-work. And we have transitioned the new coordinator trainings from a full day in-person session to a webinar format. And this change allows us to provide more flexibility and accessibility in our trainings. So the webinar format enables us to offer more personalized support and deliver valuable insights to coordinators at the times that they will need them the most. So we believe this expanded structure will greatly enhance the quality of learning by accommodating various schedules and then tailoring the training experience to better meet the needs of new coordinators. So we're very excited about this new format. The rest of the new coordinator training program is a series of monthly webinars designed to give you that just-in-time information. And we have a full list of the sessions in your resource guide, but we're going to review today what's coming in the next few months. So today, we are focused on accessibility. In October, we're going to hold a webinar on student practice. And then in November, we're going to talk about preparing for testing. Now, before we jump into today's topic of accessibility, we do want to remind everyone about some really great resources for coordinators. And the links to all of these resources are in your resource guide. And Paul has been putting that in the chat for you. The first are the coordinator checklists. Okay, so there's one checklist for each program for LEA coordinators, as well as checklists for other roles. And each checklist, it includes an extensive list of all the tasks and activities that are part of your new role. And the tasks they're listed by month, where they most likely will occur, but then some tasks may occur in other months. So depending on your local schedule or your local plans, but they are listed in the resource. And it is a Microsoft Word document that you can download, and then you can customize it to better meet your needs. The second resource is the new Coordinator How-To Hub. This is a page on the new CAASPP and ELPAC website that collects all existing how-to resources, and it organizes them by time and by topic. So it's a new web page that's pretty amazing. So if you are ever stuck on how to do something, this Coordinator How-To Hub is a great place to start. So today's topic, yes, accessibility. And to help us understand the importance of accessibility resources, we are going to start with the why. All right, so California students, we all know they demonstrate a wide variety of skills and abilities and interests. They come from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds and have very different experiences. They live in different socioeconomic circumstances as well. So Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, is a teaching approach that works to accommodate the needs and abilities of all learners. And it eliminates unnecessary hurdles, or we call them barriers, in the learning process. And an example of universal design, when we apply it to testing, is allowing enough time for all students so that students with disabilities or specific learning needs don't require the accommodation of extra time. So that's an example of UDL being applied to testing. Now, California's assessments, they were developed using the principles of UDL in recognition of diverse characteristics and needs of all students. So as a result, the interim assessments, as well as the summative assessments, include accessibility resources that address a variety of access barriers. CAASPP and ELPAC assessments are designed so that all students, not just some, not just a few, but all students who take them can participate in the tests meaningfully and demonstrate what they know and what they can do. So chances are the resources students are using in the classroom to access learning, they're available on the CAASPP and ELPAC assessments. The resources might look or function slightly different, but they're available to students to ensure equitable access to the tests. So we're going to compare multiple choice paper pencil state assessments of the past with the resources available through today's CAASPP and ELPAC tests. So let's consider some imaginary students. Okay, so Judy. Judy is easily distracted. Judy uses masking to cover surrounding text in a classroom assignment to minimize distraction. Well, did you know masking is also available on the CAASPP and ELPAC assessments for Judy? Now, Javier. Javier is an English learner who is fluent in native language Spanish. In the classroom, Javier uses a few different supports. And those same supports, like a translation glossary or a Spanish dual language stack translation, those are available for the Smarter Balanced Math Assessment and the California Science Test, or CAST. And there's even translated test directions on CAASPP and ELPAC for Javier. So it's important to note that the resources assigned for the assessment should reflect the resources the student is already using in instruction, like our imaginary students, Judy and Javier. There are ways that students can practice using those specific resources embedded in the test delivery system by actually using the training and practice or even the interim assessments. And we encourage the use of the training, practice, and interim assessments throughout the year. We want students to be familiar with those accessibility resources. All right, so equality is not the same as equity. And some of you have seen an image similar to the one on the screen on this slide. And in the past, we often talked about equality in education, providing each student with the same educational opportunities. But now we've evolved, and now we are focused on equitable education, providing each student with the tools and resources they need to be successful in school and to graduate ready for college and career. And those needs can vary by individual student. And our goal is all about equity. So here's another way to think about it. With equity, with equality, we have 4 bicyclists that you see up at the top of the screen that all have the same bike. They have equal equipment. The problem is that one cyclist uses a wheelchair. One is very tall and you can see is hunched over a bike that seems too small. We have one using a bike and it looks like a perfect fit. And then we have one small cyclist trying to ride a bike that's a bit too big. Now, instead, we want equity. With equity, each cyclist is provided a bike that meets their needs. So the cyclist in the wheelchair is provided a modified bike. The tall cyclist is now riding a larger bike. The cyclist who had the bike that was perfectly sized will still remain with that bike. And then we have that small cyclist now with a bike that's appropriately sized. So equity means that each cyclist has the correct equipment they need to perform successfully. Some students, they need something entirely different to help them achieve their goal. And in this example, when we provide all kids with the exact bike they need, either in size or structure, they'll be able to enjoy the full benefits of the activity. So the same concept applies to our assessment systems. All right, so we're going to walk through the 1, 2, 3, 4s of accessibility. So the 1 in our 1, 2, 3, 4 is the purpose. We have one purpose when it comes to accessibility, and that is access. Students with specific learning needs may require accessibility resources to fully engage and demonstrate mastery of content during instruction and on assessments. To better serve them, a wide range of resources are available for CAASPP and ELPAC summative and interim assessments to ensure that the administration of the test meets the needs of all students. And that includes those with disabilities. Through the collaboration and array of universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations are available to ensure that students' accessibility needs are met. So 1 is purpose, access. Now, when it comes to the delivery of accessibility resources, there are 2 options, all right? So we've got embedded and non-embedded. Embedded resources are digitally delivered as part of the technology platform for computer-based tests. So an example would be text-to-speech. Non-embedded resources are provided by the LEA, or local educational agency, and that's outside of the test delivery system. An example of non-embedded would be scratch paper. So keep in mind, some embedded resources are available only for specific test questions or specific domains for which they are allowed. If a non-embedded resource is shown to be available for allowed items, it may be used only for the specific items for which the embedded version of the resource is made available. Now, I'm going to explain what I just said. With the embedded calculator is a great example of this. Okay, embedded calculator is a universal tool. It's available on all CAST assessments. That's the California Science Test. So all of the CAASPP assessments, and then only on specific math items for the Smarter Balanced item specifications indicated as appropriate, and only in grades 6 through 8 and grade 11. Now, if the student is using a non-embedded calculator as an accommodation for Smarter Balanced math, they should only use the calculator on the allowed items, okay? So again, it's really important. There's a lot of details when it comes to each and every one of the accommodations, designated supports, universal tools. So, and we're going to get more into that when we get into the matrix. So resources included in the CAASPP and the ELPAC tests, they fall into 3 basic categories. And I just mentioned them. Basically universal design for learning that we talked about a few slides ago. It includes engagement, presentation, and action and expression. So there are resources that support students to remain engaged with the assessment. For example, providing breaks or a separate setting, or even noise buffers. There are also resources that support students by varying the way the assessment is presented. And an example of this would be all of the assessment might be translated for an English learner, or part of an assessment might be read aloud to a struggling reader through text-to-speech. And then finally, there are resources that support students by allowing them to respond through various actions and expressions. An example would be the use of an adaptive keyboard, or by using a scribe. All right, we're on to the number 4. There are 4 types of resources: universal tools, designated supports, accommodations, and unlisted resources. So we have universal tools. These are available to all students. It's based on individual choice and preference. You don't have to do anything to turn on a universal tool. They come built into the test. So an example would be Zoom or Notepad, Highlighter, the strike through. These are already turned on for the student. Next are the designated supports. So these are available to any student for whom a need has been identified by an adult who is familiar with the student's instructional needs. That's right. You don't need an IEP or Section 504 plan to get designated supports. Just an identified need, such as an English learner or a struggling reader, someone who's easily distracted. So this is great information to pass along to site coordinators and to your teachers in your LEA, because this message sometimes doesn't always get heard, and it really should. So just remember, designated supports. Now, designated supports, they would include, an example would be translated test directions or text-to-speech. All right, the next level we have are the accommodations. For accommodations, the student does need an active IEP or Section 504 plan, and the accommodation must be written into that official document. So it needs to be written into the IEP or Section 504 and designated on the statewide testing page of the IEP or Section 504. Okay, so it has to be documented and they must be eligible. So the accommodations are things like American Sign Language, Braille, there's word prediction. I think it's called word completion now. So those are all examples of accommodations. All right, so I'm going to pause here before we move on to the 4th type. So for the 3 types that I've listed so far, universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations, students who use these during the test, they will still get a valid score. Okay, I'm going to say that one more time because this is very important. Universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations, they do not affect the student's test score. there's no penalty to the LEA for providing these resources. These resources do not change the construct of what is being measured, okay? So there's a lot of misconceptions out there about this. So we just want to be crystal clear about these three: universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations. Now, the fourth type is unlisted resources. The student needs an active IEP or 504 plan to be able to request an unlisted resource. And there is a process that's involved in requesting those unlisted resources. Unlisted resources are resources that are not already identified as an allowed universal tool, designated support, or accommodation on the accessibility matrix. So before an unlisted resource is requested, it's so important to check the matrix. And then the next slide, I'm going to pass it over to Stephen. He's going to go over the matrix. But that matrix is going to be your number one friend. You're going to want to use that matrix and check it to confirm that that unlisted resource is truly unlisted. For example, breaks and communicative devices for amplification, they are listed in the matrix. They don't need to be requested as an unlisted resource. Now, in order for a student to access an unlisted resource, the test site coordinator or LEA coordinator may submit a request to the California Department of Education, and they do this through TOMS, the Test Operation Management System. It must happen a minimum of 10 business days prior to the student's first day of testing. The CDE will then review the item and determine if the construct being measured is changed with the use of this unlisted resource. Now, if the construct has not changed, the student will get a valid score. If it has changed, the student's score may be removed from the aggregations reported, not be counted as participating for accountability, be invalidated for CAASPP, and or assigned the lowest obtainable scale score for ELPAC. Okay, so that's why you really want to check that matrix. The unlisted resources are very rare. Okay, now an example of an unlisted resource would be that would change the construct of the test would be requesting a calculator in grades 3 through 5 for the math assessment. Okay, so I'm going to pass it now over to Stephen, who's going to talk to us about the matrix.
Thank you, Erin. As Erin said, my name is Stephen Bartlett. I work for Los Angeles County Office of Education, and we're going to talk about the California Assessment Accessibility Resources Matrix. It contains all universal tools, designated supports, and accommodations for CAASPP and ELPAC. And that matrix is your one-stop shop for information about accessibility resources for those assessments. So there's a link in your resource guide to that matrix. The document is a great resource. We recommend that you keep a copy handy at all times. There's also a one-page document that lists the available resources for each assessment. They are called the Accessibility Resource Graphics, and a link to each of these resources is included in your resource guide. So Erin talked about assigning supports equitably as well as what type of supports are available, but did you know there's an optional process that's defined by Smarter Balance for this same work? And the process is intended to ensure that students have resources for assessments that align with what they receive in their instruction, and that those resources are available in the system. So we want the process to be equitable so all students can show what they know and can do on those statewide assessments. And you, as the LEA coordinator, are playing a big role in defining, promoting, refining, and championing the process at your LEA. So we're going to look at the process from start to finish for accessibility. Accessibility resources can help students learn and demonstrate their learning during daily instruction and on assessments if used consistently, effectively, and appropriately. ISAP stands for Individual Student Assessment Accessibility Profile and contains 7 steps. This easily customizable process helps educators establish a consistent and effective system for providing appropriate accessibility resources to students based on their needs. The 7 steps for the ISAP process are roles and responsibilities, information and training, identification, selection, test operations management system entry, pre-administration check, and testing session check. Educators who know the student should be involved in identifying students who will benefit from designated supports, accommodations, or both. Selecting the appropriate designated supports and accommodations for each student identified, performing a pre-administration check of assigned access supports, and checking for delivery of assigned designated supports and accommodations at the time of test administration. As a coordinator, our focus is typically on selecting key staff members and defining roles, providing training and information to staff, students, and parents, and entering designated supports and accommodations into the test engine. Step 1 of the ISAP process is establishing roles and responsibilities, which means knowing who does what at your LEA. Establishing roles means identifying appropriate staff to support the process of providing accessibility resources. LEA should also establish a team with representation from school sites to help develop or maintain the use of accessibility resources. Just a reminder that this work may be embedded into an already existing team in the LEA. To establish responsibilities, the LEA team should address how information will be communicated to the various audiences across the LEA. This includes parents, teachers, administrators, and students. Communication is critical to effective implementation, both face-to-face verbal communication and written communication. Building a plan for how the LEA staff will provide support to their sites as they implement the process, and a plan for how to monitor appropriate and equitable use will be critical to effective implementation of the LEA process. Let's also take a moment to consider the special education staff and IEP process at your LEA. Special education staff, general education staff, and testing coordinators are constantly engaged in discussions to ensure that students with an IEP or Section 504 plan are provided with the correct accommodations as outlined in their individual educational plan. CAASPP and ELPAC coordinators need to be in regular communication with the special education department and be aware of how to pull that data from special education data systems. We need to make sure that there are no breakdowns in that communication so that all receive their accommodations. Step 2 is providing information and training, which means ensuring that accurate information and explicit training is provided to the different education groups in the LEA. Ideally, this step would occur early in the year and would help prepare educators and other staff in the LEA to make sound decisions regarding use of accessibility resources in the classroom and on assessments. There are some items to consider as step 2 is addressed. Who in the LEA needs information and who needs explicit training? When will training occur and what structure or format? Who will provide training to staff on what resources are available to which students? Who will engage with families? How will they be engaged? Families should be provided with basic information on the availability of accessibility resources and on who the site or LEA contact person is if they have questions. What information needs to be included in the training sessions and what reference materials can be used? CD and ETS have a variety of reference materials that can be used for local training that will be shared later in the session. By addressing these questions, the LEA ensures that the selection of accessibility resources is consistent, equitable, and appropriate. In step 3, educators identify students that would benefit from supports. Remember, we want the resources on the assessment to match instruction. So a great place to start is considering students receiving supports in the classroom. We need to make sure that educators identifying students are familiar with the students and their needs. Again, we want this process to be equitable, so the training aspect from step 2 should cover how identification is done in your LEA. Once each individual student's needs are identified, it's time to match the students with the appropriate resources. This is step 4, selection, and should include the student in the selection process. Again, as the LEA coordinator, you probably won't have a role in this step, but training is important so that the process is equitable. The CAASPP tool is an optional web-based tool that was released by the CDE, which may be used to help educators understand how the available accessibility resources align with various student needs. This, in turn, helps educators select the most appropriate resource for assessment. Users enter student data into the tool, select specific assessments, and identify student needs. The CAASPP tool will then create a list of accessibility resources which might match the student needs. The CAASPP tool can be used in facilitating uploads to TOMS. However, that is not its primary function. The link is in your resource guide to the CAASPP tool. Discuss this tool with your team to see how it might support your process. Step 5 is TOMS upload. In this step, the designated supports and accommodations that have been identified for students are entered into TOMS. This can be done manually or in bulk. Data for the bulk upload can come from a variety of places, including but not limited to the Upload Test Settings Student Accommodations template, downloadable in the TOMS Students tab, the CAASPP tool, and some student information systems and or special education data systems will have this option. Please check with your vendor to see if they have this option available. There are many ways to accomplish this work. Please keep in mind, accessibility resources are selected separately in TOMS for CAASPP and ELPAC. Entering the selected accessibility resources in TOMS is the responsibility of the CAASPP or ELPAC coordinator at the site and or the LEA level. Who does this will vary depending on how your LEA is set up. Another important thing to remember is that resources located or loaded in TOMS are available to students on interim assessments. It's an excellent practice to have students use these accommodations and designated supports on the interim assessments, or practice and training tests even, prior to students being administered the summative assessment. The biggest takeaway here is that you need to know what processes are in place at your LEA. Steps 6 and 7 in the CAASPP process happen close to the time when the summative assessments will take place. It is important to note that steps 6 and 7 are only required for designated supports and accommodations, but not for universal tools. Step 6 is the pre-administration check, meaning that all resources are checked in TOMS before testing starts. You can do this by pulling the Student Test Settings report in TOMS to verify students are assigned the correct accommodations and designated supports. If, as an LEA coordinator, you are delegating the entry of test settings to site coordinators, it is essential to review test settings against expectations at the site, grade, and student level. Step 7 is the testing session check, where the test administrator checks the supports in the test administrator interface as the test session is started. This means that the test administrator will need a list of the assigned designated supports and accommodations for their group of students. The test administrator approves students who log into the test session, and Use the view setting icon to confirm the correct accessibility resources are available for each student. If test settings are not correctly assigned, do not test until TOMS is updated. It can take up to 48 hours for each system to sync after those updates are made in TOMS. We have one last thing to do before we get to all of your questions, and that is to assign homework. I promise you that we are not assigning busy work. Instead, we're going to focus you on the tasks that have some and we have some next steps for you to accomplish. Excuse me. First up, we want you to ignore the dog who ate your homework. We want you to find out what the process is in your LEA for assigning test settings is. Or if you find that there isn't one, get together a team, create one. Next, we want you to share the resources with your site administrators. Links and descriptions of resources are in your resource guide. And lastly, start thinking about the training needs of those in your LEA around accessibility. The resource guide contains links to existing resources, which are a great jumping off point. I'll hand it back over to Paul.
Righty, Stephen, thank you. Can you move it over to the next slide, please? Wonderful. All right. So on this next portion of our webinar, we're going to take a few of your questions, and we probably have about 20 minutes. So please submit any questions you have, and we're going to go ahead and start with the ones that have already been submitted. So Steve and Aaron, there's this person, she's asking, we have about 300 EL students who are not fluent in English. The content of their CAASPP math and science test can be translated into their home language. Question. And only the directions on their ELA CAASPP. Another question. I need to be clear on translation guides. I guess this is pertaining to high school.
Yeah, it gets a little tricky because there's translation glossaries that are embedded. There are stat translations for Spanish, and that's for math and the CAST. And then we have translated test directions, which are, this is how you log in, not the actual items themselves. So I think that the matrix is a great resource for you so that you have it in writing, along with the accessibility guide that's on the CAASPP and ELPAC website. So those are two resources, and I believe both of them are linked in the resource guide that I would refer you to, because it'll be very clear, and you want that in writing. I get confused all the time, and you want to be very clear, especially when you are tasked with implementing and communicating to your staff.
I want to add one thing for the Smarter Balance ELA in math. There are some supports on that question on what might be appropriate for English learners as published by Smarter Balance. So there's also a resource available from Smarter Balance where certain designated supports, which can be assigned to English learners by educators, might be most usefully chosen for those English learners. And that's on the Smarter Balance side. I believe that document is called Usability, Accessibility, and Accommodations Guidelines.
Wonderful. All right, thank you. This next person is asking, I just reviewed the ISAP process and noticed that there is a, quote, permissive mode, which is embedded, but I'm not seeing that support anywhere in the accessibility graphic.
Yeah, it's one of those, it's very confusing. Permissive mode, it needs to be turned on when you have something that needs to interface with a secure browser, and it allows that to happen. So one example a while ago was speech to text. And so now that's embedded though. But if you have something like Braille, like a embosser that has to be connected to the device, and you need it to work with a secure browser, because the secure browser locks everything down on the computer. And so this would allow an approved device to interface with the test delivery system without interfering with the secure browser. So that's what the permissive mode is for. Again, that accessibility guide will give you more information and some examples when you would actually need to select permissive or assign permissive mode.
Wonderful. Thank you. Alrighty. This person is asking if we could please share the tools that you use to collect or document designated support.
Yeah, so I think so someone previously asked if it's required to document designated supports. It is not a requirement, but it's a great practice to document those because it's not officially in an IEP or 504. You might have a student that that would benefit from a designated support, but that does not have an IEP or 504. So in my former district, we would create a document, and the documents, they're out of date. I wouldn't share them with you, but we actually mirrored TOMS and what it looked like in the TOMS interface so that the site coordinator could take that document and actually enter the information easily because it mirrored the interface in TOMS. And that was for the one-on-one or the one at a time entry of test settings into TOMS. So it served as two purposes. One, it gave us documentation for those kiddos that needed a designated support and they don't have an official document like an IEP. And then it also allowed the site coordinator to collect the information from the teachers to then enter it, because we all know that only site coordinators and LAA coordinators have the permission available to enter those test settings into TOMS. So I've seen a variety out there, and it's really a local decision how you do that if you wish to do that. But that's how we did it in my LEA.
Okay, thank you. Someone had asked about the matrix earlier, and I'm going to go ahead and submit that right now on the CDE website. Okay, Nick,
Paul,
Paul?
I also dropped the
Oh.
link to that in answer to that question, so it's also
Wonderful.
in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you.
And Paul,
Right.
there was a question about calculator. And I want to clarify this because this is a question that gets asked a lot. So the calculator, there's an embedded calculator that's a universal tool. So it's in the testing interface for grades 6 through 8 and grade 11 on the math smarter balanced assessment, but it's only going to appear. The calculator icon will only appear for certain items. And that's going to be turned on for all of the students in grade 6 through 8 and grade 11 on the mathematics Smarter Balance assessment. And then it's also available for the CAASPP assessments. So this question was around if all the students in an 8th grade math class use a calculator all throughout the year, can they use a calculator on the Smarter Balance math assessment? Well, they all will have access to the universal tool because everyone has access to that. Now, for a non-embedded calculator, for those same items, that is considered an accommodation. So it is not available for all students. It is only available for those students that have an IEP or a 504, and it is designated written into their 504 or their IEP. And then the example that we talked about for grades 3 through 5, non-embedded calculator, that would become that would be considered an unlisted resource if that was written into their IEP or 504. So you can see it gets really complicated, and I would take that matrix and really have that as a resource, because you have a calculator means a different thing depending on the item, the grade level, and the test. And so just know it's a universal tool in one category, but it's considered an accommodation if it's not embedded. And then for a different grade level, it's considered unlisted. So keep that in mind. Very, very in all these little details. They're all answered and spelled out in that matrix.
Wonderful. Wow. Thank you for that clarification. Alrighty, next question. If an EL student has testing accommodations uploaded from SACE on the CAASPP site, do those accommodations also get entered on the student's ELPAC testing?
So I believe this references something that's starting in this school year, 24-25, that students testing supports and accommodations for ELA, Math Science, and LPAC and alternate LPAC are sent from SACE to TOMS on a nightly basis if activated. One of our colleagues has investigated this quite extensively and might be able to answer this specifically, but I believe the best source for the answer to this question, and there's also a subsequent question that suggests something similar to ask about whether something has to be listed on statewide assessments form for SACE in order to be uploaded. And I believe that is true. If it is listed on the IEP services page, it should also be listed. So students receiving a service, they should, in order to receive it as an accommodation or designated support, it would have to also be listed on statewide assessments page in order for it to be uploaded. But the best source for the answers to these questions is going to be SACE, although my understanding is this process is very new, and so I would refer to SACE for any guidance on
And Stephen, I'd like to add, so think about when an IEP is written. We want to do our best to really train our teachers that are our resource teachers and special education staff. Because when an IEP is written and an accommodation is assigned in that IEP, remember, there's some test settings that are considered a designated support for maybe for ELPAC, but are considered an accommodation for CAT. They have different, depending on the grade level, it could depend on the subject matter, and or the actual test, CAASPP and ELPAC. So again, that matrix is your best resource to help your special education staff really, the more detailed that they can be in those IEPs, then that's helpful with the translation into TOMS. Regardless if they use SACE or you're doing it batch upload or one at a time, it's really important that those IEPs document that they're test specific, content specific, grade specific, because and a designated support might be an accommodation for ELA, but it's a designated support for math. So, so anyway, just keep that in mind. It's not so easy to just one size fits all, because it's not a one size fits all.
Wonderful. Thank you. All righty, next question. If an accommodation is listed on the IEP services page, but not on the IEP statewide assessments page, can it still be provided to the student? I think that's something you were just talking about, Aaron.
Yeah, we did. I believe this references SACE.
Wonderful. Okay. All right. Next one, the ELPAC information guide. I cannot find where it talks about exemptions. My questions was about exemptions for summative, not alt summative. I want to know, since someone told me there may be exemptions for the summative.
Yes. So that's an example would be like if you have a student that might not be able to participate in the speaking domain for the summative LPAC, because they're the example that we often hear about is it being a selective mute. And so they would not be able to participate in that. So My understanding is that information is in the information guide for ELPAC. And so if you're not able to find that, I recommend that you reach out to your success agent and they'll be able to find the resource that has the language that you need and the information. So I'm sorry, I'm the one that put in the ELPAC information guide because I was under the impression that it was in that document.
Okay.
I added a link to the initial and summative ELPAC domain exemption decision-making tool, which can be used for making those decisions on a yearly
Thank you.
basis.
Perfect.
I don't recall whether or not it's in the ELPAC information guide, but it is good to note that the ELPAC information guide has moved this year. It went from the CDE's website to a web-based format in the amongst the other manuals, CAASPP and ELPAC manuals.
Going back to the SACE question, Tyler from ETS put in a note that I just want to bring up and reiterate that there is the automated that was just turned on for all districts 2 weeks ago, SACE TOMS integration. Still working out the bugs, and there's a lot of considerations if you're going to turn that on. But there's always been this option within SACE to download a file from SACE and then so export it and then upload that manually. So that still exists. So thank you, Tyler, for putting that in the Q&A. We appreciate that. So you have a lot of options with uploading. You can do one at a time. You can use the batch, use the template, batch upload, the ISAP tool, and then do the batch upload. Or you can use the integration if that is something that you want to turn on and pursue. And then if you are using SACE, you have also the option of downloading and exporting because you can do that manually, but they use the same, I guess, the same requirements or columns that are in that batch upload template.
Wonderful. All righty. This person is asking, this may have already been answered, but when a student has a 504 or IEP, do we have to manually go in every year when doing CAASPP testing and apply those tools for the students, or will they transfer over showing those tools were needed from the previous year?
Those do not automatically transfer over. They're wiped each year. And you will need to re-upload them based on the current year's designations, whether or not the student will receive those designated supports and accommodations in the current year. So it is a yearly process, and they are wiped each year.
Paul, there's a question about the new accessibility graphics coming out. We have the 2024-25 matrix that's been posted, and we're all anxiously anticipating those accessibility graphics to come out anytime now. So just be patient and keep checking. That's what I would do. That's what I'm doing because I want access to those too.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. All righty. This next question, we have about maybe 2 more minutes or so. And this person is stating, I noticed that the matrix under unlisted resources, translated word list is a non-embedded resource. Under what circumstance might that be permitted?
That's a great question. And I think that the best place to find some examples would be that accessibility guide because it goes through each and every designated support and accommodation, and it goes through some examples. For the unlisted resource, you might want to reach out to your special education department and have a chat and find out if there are students, because remember, unlisted resources are very rare. So those experts that work with populations of students that might need a word list, they might be the best person to go to find out what would be an example of that. Because again, unlisted resources are very rare. So I don't have expertise with that area, but I know that somebody probably does that's in your special education department.
And the process for assigning a unlisted resource will always include CDE review. So anything that is requested as an unlisted resource is not pre-identified in TOMS as something that's previously determined used as a designated supported universal tool and is sent to CDE for review for individual review. Oftentimes designated, unlisted resources can result in an invalidation of a score as well.
Wonderful, thank you. All righty, we have time for one last question here. I was told by someone that ELPAC domain exemptions can only be used for disabilities that are low incidence disabilities. If the IEP team completes this form, then is it okay to do an exemption if the disability is not a low incidence disability?
I have never heard that about low incidence, but again, and I'm not sure if you're hearing that from the CDE, Special Education Department, but I think that there's no language about that on the document that Stephen put into the chat, the tree. So again, I would refer you first and foremost to your success agent if this is something, or your county office of education, your assessment person. There's RAN members, and maybe they can reach out to the CDE on your behalf and get more clarification for that. Oh, and Tyler has put, yes, it's the TOMS user guide that actually has, it's more of a technical how to actually manage those in the domain exemptions in the in TOMS themselves, but actually making those decisions using that tree. If there's any questions, also the ELPAC CDE web, the email address at the CDE ELPAC office could probably be able to answer your question best in terms of the exemptions, the domain exemptions.
Okay, well, wonderful.
Yeah,
And,
thank you, Tyler. ELPAC at cde.ca.gov. That is where I would put it. So we'll put that in the chat.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Tyler, as well. And yeah, I guess that pretty much wraps it up. Any questions that we didn't answer, or if anybody can think of anything, please reach out to CDE or to the references that we had put in the chat. All right, Steve, yeah, thank you so much. All right, to wrap it up, we'd like to promote some upcoming training opportunities. And there is a link in your resource guide so you can register for these trainings. First up, we have the upcoming new coordinator training, one in October 24th, and the topic will be student practice. There's another one in November, November 21st, where the topic will be preparing for testing. And then December 12th is a follow-up or a continuation of preparing for testing. Also, we have the coffee sessions, and these are virtual coffee sessions hosted by the CDE and ETS, and they offer opportunities for LEA staff to ask questions, get answers about assessments, trainings, resources, and much more. And they happen monthly for most months of the year. And lastly, we want to call out the California Assessment Conference, and this will be the 6th annual CAC. and it will take place October 15th through the 17th at the Riverside Convention Center in Riverside, California. And this conference is designed specifically for classroom educators, site administrators, assessment coordinators, and others. So please help us spread the word. There's more information can be found at the link to the CAC website in your resource guide. And if you haven't already, please, we encourage you to sign up for the Assessment Spotlight emails. You can find subscription instructions in your resource guide. For additional updates, follow the CDE on X at CDE Assessments. You can also connect with the CDE on Instagram. The links are in the resource guide. Alrighty, and that concludes our training for today. We hope that the information we shared today was helpful and timely. And we always want to remind you that you are not alone in this work. You can reach out through the networks of coordinators in similar roles throughout the state, your LEAs, success agents, and you always have staff at the CDE ready and available to answer your questions. When you exit the Zoom, you'll be directed to a post-training evaluation. If you could please take a few minutes of your time and provide us some feedback, we would really appreciate it. And with that, on behalf of CDE, my colleagues Aaron Gordon and Stephen Bartlett, we thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next webinar. Have a great afternoon, everyone.